TrojanVision presents the 2016 campaign, featuring political science experts from the Troy University faculty, with an in-depth look at the 2016 presidential campaign. The panelists include Dr. Stephen L. Taylor, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and an expert in electoral and comparative politics, as well as Latin American politics. He is the author of 3 books. Dr. Taylor's most recent book, A Different Democracy, American Government in a 31-Country Perspective, was published by the Yale University Press in 2014. Dr. Mariam Stevenson specializes in American politics and immigration law. She has a PhD from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a JD from the University of Memphis. She is currently working on a book manuscript on immigration. She is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Troy University. The moderator is Dr. Michael O. Slobodchikov, who specializes in relations between Russia and the former Soviet states, international conflict and peace, and comparative politics. He is the author of 2 books. His most recent book, Building Hegemonic Order Russia's Way, Rules, Stability, and Predictability in a Post-Soviet Space, was published in 2014. He is a regular contributor to Russia Direct and has often served as an analyst on Russian relations with Ukraine for BBC World News, as well as Voice of Russia Radio. He is an assistant professor of political science at Troy University.
We're about a month away from the election, and now we're seeing an ever-tightening race. The polls are showing it's almost a dead heat. What insights can we get from these polls?
Well, I think at this point in time, we're seeing that people are starting to pay attention to the race, although many, amazingly, are still not fully engaged. A lot of folks will have just started paying attention with the debates on Monday. So one of the things we'll be looking forward to see how those debates play out in the polls. We've seen a race that tightened before the GOP convention, and then Mrs. Clinton opened a pretty large lead for some time, then it began to tighten again. It's difficult to fully understand what all this means at this point. She still has a slight edge in most polls, I think in most of the poll averages, but only a small advantage. I think part of what we're seeing is something we know in political science, but is often not obvious to the media or to observers, and that we often think candidate matters more than it does. There is a large slice of the population that's going to vote Democratic regardless of who the candidate is. There's a large slice that's going to vote Republican no matter who the candidate is. So we start with those sort of bases, and then we build from there. And so it becomes this question about those that are still on one edge or the other. And most people already have a partisan predisposition.
And yet we're seeing increasing numbers of elites that have worked in past administrations, in past Republican administrations, coming out and supporting Hillary Clinton and turning away from the Republican nominee, Donald Trump. And we're seeing increasing numbers of newspapers that traditionally support the Republicans turning to support Hillary Clinton, such as we had the Arizona Republic, which in over 126 years has never supported the Democratic nominee, now is supporting Hillary Clinton. So we have this disconnect between the polls and the elites. What's going on with that?
Well, that is the million-dollar question. I think a lot of what we have going on is partly what makes this such an unusual race, in that we have a career politician running against a non-career politician. In fact, an individual, a candidate who has never run for public office ever. So not only is he not a politician, he's anti-establishment, but he's also to some degree anti-politics, or the anti-politician. So that is kind of a new phenomenon, uncharted territory, and a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump campaign has been fairly negative. If we look at the rhetoric regarding race relations, and regarding immigration and immigrants in the United States, Muslims, for example, Muslim Americans, refugees, these are opinions that are, while they are shared by some members of the Republican Party, they are not entirely popular sentiments among the American population as a whole. So if we look at public opinion generally, and we look at public opinion towards these types of comments, it's not wholly unsurprising that we have members of the elite who are turning their backs against the Republican candidate. Because if you think about it, these are individuals who have to run for office again. And so public opinion still hugely matters to them.
I think I would pick up on some of this. I think we're trying to examine a in some ways, very unusual circumstance while it's still in motion. So we really don't fully understand everything that's going on. We don't fully understand Mr. Trump's support in its totality. We don't necessarily even understand the way the party's reacting to it, nor what this means for the party going forward. And in my own mind, I keep vacillating between, on the one hand, I agree with Dr. Stevenson, this is an unusual election because Mr. Trump is a political novice, and political novices don't get nominated for, typically at least, major party candidacies. In fact, I believe in an earlier iteration of this discussion, I didn't think he was going to be nominated, partially for that reason, which I was wrong about that, quite clearly. But like I said a moment ago, on the other hand, I think some of what we're seeing is normal, which is, why do we see a tight race? We have a polarized population. We knew that already. And one of the reasons we have political parties, or more accurately, why political parties exist in democratic systems, is that they are shorthands for voters to make choices. And so while some of the elites of the Republican Party are obviously dissatisfied with Mr. Trump as the party's candidate, nonetheless, he is the candidate of the Republican Party. And as I already stated, we know that that means a large number of people will vote for the Republican because, given their choices, they have two choices. Our system, while theoretically provides more than two choices, the reality is the institutional constraints really push us toward a binary choice. We as voters have, if we're going to vote, two fundamental choices. And this is not to denigrate third-party options, but this is the way the math works. And we can talk more about that in a minute if we like. But so voters that look at this and say, well, I don't like Democrats, for example, or I don't like Mrs. Clinton, and therefore my only choice is to vote for Mr. Trump, or not to vote at all, or maybe to default to a third-party candidate. So I think in some ways what we're simply seeing is normal politics, despite all the weirdness that's going on at the same time. And I can't remember where I read the commenter who said it to me a couple of months even ago, that this is the election that will launch 1,000 dissertations, because Mr. Trump is creating, regardless of anything else, a number of experiments. One is, does quality of candidate matter by normal standards? Because by normal standards, Mr. Trump is not a quality candidate, so to speak, in that his resume does not conform to what we would expect. He's not running the campaign the way we would expect him to run it. He doesn't have a pronounced ground game to get people out to how will that matter on election day? We all think it matters. We're about to find out at least a little bit how much it matters for turnout for the Republican Party. The way he's conducted his fundraising has not been conventional. I mean, you can go down, there's a long list of things that supposedly you're supposed to do that he's not doing. And we're going to see whether it actually does matter or not, right? So, but that, I think, is the fascinating thing, is to watch and see, especially as voters engage more over the next several weeks. There are two more debates plus the vice presidential debate. There's more campaign to be done. Will this remain a tight race? And how much of that is that Mr. Trump is saying things that appeal to people, which is clearly part of it? How much of it is he's the standard bearer of a mainstream party and therefore is going to get at least 40-something% of the vote no matter what? That becomes the question. Right?
And we've seen how he's said things to appeal to his supporters, and then as he's tried to move towards the general election, he's tried to walk some things back and then gone back to appeal more to his supporters. How difficult a task is it to move from the primaries for both candidates to then move to the general election and walk some of their statements back and try and move toward the center?
Well, obviously, that is something that's always going to be harder to do when we don't have an incumbent president. So both the candidates are having to move from either pole back to the center. So it's more pronounced, not more difficult, but more pronounced, certainly to the electorate. That said, it's not an easy thing to do, particularly in a year when the primary race goes as long as it did this time. We have been used to, in the last several elections, seeing the primary season being much shorter. And this year we saw it was a fairly lengthy one. We weren't sure who the candidates or who the nominees were going to be for either party until well into the summer. So that was a little bit different and a little bit unusual this year, and it gives the candidates certainly less time to pivot or to shift their issue preferences from being a little further to the left or further to the right back to the center in order to get those in order to get the more independent votes. What was your original question? I'm sorry.
The question was, how difficult is it to make that pivot?
So it's certainly something that has to be done, and it's something that is done in every election, regardless of whether or not we see or whether or not we have a incumbent president or not. Typically, in years when we have an incumbent president, that's where we tend to hear claims of shifting and flip-flopping. Is the term that we tend to hear in those types of elections. We haven't really heard so much those accusations this time, although we have to some degree with regard to Mr. Trump on certain issues like the birtherism and things like that. But generally in years where you don't have an incumbent, you don't tend to see those same allegations because both candidates are having to shift their preferences back to the center. That said, however, we haven't really seen a significant shift or pivot on the Trump camp. So he's pretty much stayed, where he was during the primary race. He, with the exception of a few minor things, he really has not pivoted yet.
Well, there's been some effort to get him to pivot, but
Sure.
he keeps going back to his original stances, which I think has infuriated some of his campaign staff.
I think but what they've been trying to do is more of a tonal pivot than
Yes.
necessarily a policy
Right,
pivot.
yes.
Right.
And I was trying to think about what are the things that one might have been accused, either candidate of flip-flopping or changing on in this cycle. But the focus has not really been on particular policy pronouncements. It's either about, it's been on the Clinton side, it's been a focus on whether certain past actions are scandalous or not, or to what degree they're scandalous. The email issue, Benghazi really hasn't been as big of a thing as it was. It's mostly been about emails. In the Trump case, it's really been about his propensity to say things that create these sort of ongoing rolling mini media storms, whether it's the Gold Star parents or whether just after the debate about the Miss Universe candidate that he often feels the need to respond to, and his campaign managers clearly want him to stop doing that, and he's had a hard time doing that for whatever reason. He's calmed down, I think, some in the last several weeks. But policy, I was trying to think. The only thing that I can think of, and it came up in the debate on Monday, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the fact that the Obama administration is trying to forward that arrangement, and Mrs. Clinton has come out in opposition to it, arguably, at least partially, to counter Bernie Sanders in the primaries. But beyond that, I really even can't think of an issue that has been discussed with great specificity that you could say, well, you changed your mind on that.
Well, I think that's exactly the problem. We don't know where they stand on the various issues because they haven't, beyond overarching issues, they haven't presented a lot of policies.
I would disagree on the following sense. I think that they've made, Mrs. Clinton's website has plenty of policy positions, and I've seen things from Mr. Trump as well. But the focus of the media coverage is really what I'm focusing on, that we don't talk about enough that it even becomes a talking point on the campaign trail, right?
That's
true. I understand what you're saying, but this has been a very much about personalities. It often is about personalities, but even more than ever.
The same was even true with regard to the debate. It was really almost more of a debate of personalities rather than a policy. I mean, it started out being a policy-driven debate, but after 10 minutes or so, it very quickly shifted
Yes.
to one of personalities rather than policy, which was different than what we're used to seeing.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to shift gears a little bit. I mean, I want to stay with the overall presidential theme, but I know that we talked about in our last meetings the electoral map and how it would be very difficult for a Republican to win. And now that we're seeing a tightening of the race, and we're certainly seeing a lot of states that are now in dead heats, is the electoral map still favoring the Democrats?
I think if you look at the electoral math right now, the Democrats still have an edge, mostly because of Virginia. But we've seen, certainly in the last, 2 to 3 weeks, maybe less, substantial tightening in places like Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, that at one point seemed to be all in the Democratic column. The bottom line is, though, that the Democrats still have generically the advantage in the Electoral College, but it is shaping up to be a far tighter race than we thought it might have been a month ago.
Right, right. And certainly that has profound implications on other races down the ticket. Certainly after the Republican National Convention, after the Democratic National Convention, there was talk that Trump was such a flawed candidate that he would hurt the down races in terms of the Senate, even the House at some point they were talking about. What does it look like now in terms of the Senate? Are the Republicans in danger of losing a majority?
Well, if we look at the Senate right now, Democrats need to pick up anywhere between 4 to 6 seats in order to take over the Senate. And I say 4 to 6 because right now, assuming that Democrats keep all of their current seats, they would need 4 additional seats in order to get to 50. And assuming that Hillary Clinton wins, then her vice president would be the tiebreak. If he doesn't win, or if she doesn't win, and Trump wins, then Democrats would need 5. They would need to pick up 5 seats in order to have 4 to get to 50, and then the additional one to gain the majority. I say 6 because the Senate seat, or the Senate race in Nevada, has tightened, and it appears as though Heller, who is a Republican, might be is in a pretty good position to actually win that seat. And if he does, then they're going to need an additional seat. And that's the seat that Minority Leader Reid has retired from.
Okay.
I mean, it gets back to this question also about getting out the vote, right? If it in fact is the case, and we don't know right now, that the Trump campaign is not going to be as active as candidates in the past have been, this could have effects down ballot. Now, the Republicans have a structural advantage in the House, and then the makeup of the Senate contest is in the Democrats' favor this year, but still it's an iffy proposition as has already been described. But yeah, how badly or not, what's the gap between the two candidates, right? If it's a close race, the Republicans should retain control of the Congress. If it becomes a gap that we thought we were going to see several weeks ago, then it could be very problematic for the Republicans. But that remains to be seen. Right now, it looks like it's going to be pretty close.
Okay. And going back to polling for 1 second, I think that Hillary Clinton is counting on a lot of constituencies that supported Barack Obama in the last election, that she's having problems connecting with, that Trump has helped her connect with to some degree, the Latino population, the African American population. And traditionally, those have not turned out to vote in huge numbers, except for recently. How accurate do you think we can look at the polls right now and say that they're adequately capturing what's really going on with these constituencies?
Well, that's the problem that we always have with polling. Is how accurate are they, especially when we talk about capturing who is actually going to show up to vote on election day. And so it's very difficult. I think a lot is going to hinge on the popularity or unpopularity of Trump in the coming weeks. I think we may end up in a situation where if the polls continue to tighten and continue to show that Trump actually has a chance, we may see an increase in voter turnout, and we may very well see minorities coming out to vote in large numbers. If the opposite occurs, I would not be surprised if we have lower voter turnout and more of a free rider type problem where or a self-fulfilling prophecy problem where the idea being if people don't perceive that Trump is likely to beat Secretary Clinton, then those individuals very well may not turn up to vote, and that could cause a very different election result than what was previously anticipated.
No, I think it's a key challenge for it's a key challenge for both campaigns to get their votes out. But we've already talked about that in regards to the Trump campaign. I think the Clinton campaign has clear demographic advantages in a large number of groups. And so part of their challenge in the next month plus is to get them excited enough to go to the polls. And of course, part of the concern from their perspective is that because Mrs. Clinton is not the most popular or charismatic of candidates, that some of the voters might not be as interested to turn out. In terms of accuracy of polls, we really don't know until it's all said and done. On balance, if we look at the last, cycles, quite a few cycles, on balance, the polling has been pretty good. It gets trickier, of course, when you get state-specific polling and all that kind of thing. But it'll certainly have an effect on the way the candidates campaign because they're trying to get people to the polls.
Right. And I'd like to build off something that you just mentioned, and that is the likability factor of both candidates. I can't remember a president or unlikability. Exactly. Yeah. No, I can't remember an election in recent memory where both candidates have been so unpopular as they are now.
They're the two most popular. How do I say this? They're historically the two least liked candidates, I think, of all time. So we've been doing
of all
these polls.
time, right?
So yeah, that's why.
So at what point do you get people who turn out to vote against someone to actually get excited about voting for a specific candidate? Isn't that part of the difficulty?
I think to some degree, to be totally honest, but this is not my area of expertise, that there's always a large number of people voting against. And I think it also comes back to what I was saying earlier in the discussion. Most people are voting based on their partisan preferences, based on what they think that basket of whatever policies that they prefer. And usually it's a handful of things that motivate particular voters to go to the polls, whether it's taxes or abortion or foreign policy. That's what they're voting on, and they think that one party or the courts or the other are going to be what they want. So that's why they go vote. It's clear that it's more unlikely, I can only think of one election this fits with in recent memory, where people are excited to go vote for someone. I think Obama 2008, we saw a much higher than normal voter turnout, and it was driven by excitement. But I don't know that, there's Bush Kerry 2004, was that driven, who was excited about that? I don't think there was somebody, must have been somewhere, but I don't think it was of the same type, right? I can't think of a previous election that really fit that mold, at least in recent memory. So I think on balance, people, because we hover right around, we're excited, we break, 55%, 53%, where, which globally is pretty low for these kinds of for elections. We don't all show up to vote here. So I don't know that that's even the issue, except this concern about both sides are going to be worried about depressed turnout because of the likability factor.
Okay.
Well, one of the strategies that political scientists look at in determining a successful campaign, one of the things that we do look at is attempting to persuade your opponent's voters against voting for your opponent and voting for you instead. So that certainly is a campaign strategy and one that's often utilized. I think in this situation, however, it's not so much a strategy per se as it is, just as you said, the unlikability of the two candidates and the candidates kind of playing off of the unlikability of their opponent. But yeah, I mean, I certainly agree. It is. It's certainly not so much the fact that we don't have a charismatic candidate in this election. It's more so that we don't typically have that charismatic candidate.
Okay. And if we're as polarized as we are, we're now in the midst of debates. Everyone's looking at how the debate swayed people. If we're as polarized as we are, do the debates really matter at the end of the day?
Probably not as much as we think that they do. I don't think as much as the news media wants to think that they do. The news media, on balance, wants a horse race so they can talk about it. Cable news is less interested generically, regardless of which network we're talking about, is less interested in informing us as they are getting us to watch, because they have to sell commercials between the talking head time. So horse race is important. So all this comparison stuff is important. And again, it's not my area, but I'm fairly certain that there's a literature in political science that actually says the debates don't matter that much. And that my view was that it was my view of the debate was that if you're going to score it like it was a contest, Mrs. Clinton was factually more accurate than Mr. Trump, and her composure was more appropriate than was Mr. Trump's. Now, but if you're going to score it on how it affected the race, my guess is it was roughly a tie, because the Clinton supporters thought she won, the Trump supporters thought he won, and I'm not sure that sort of undecided middle space was affected all that much. I know, well, I'll give Dr. Stevenson the last couple of minutes, but if you want to.
No, I agree, and I think, if you look at the numbers, I think various media outlets are saying that approximately 40% of the voters are pretty solidly in the Clinton camp, 40% in the Trump camp, and then we've got the 20% that's kind of undecided and or low information type voters. Now, the question becomes: are those individuals even going to vote? And how much were they swayed, one way or another during the debate? Typically we don't see, as Dr. Taylor said, much of a bump one way or another after the debates. If we do, it's typically after the first debate. But the polls haven't come out yet, so we're not really sure what's actually going to happen there. But I agree. I don't really anticipate much of a shift.
Well, I remember the first Obama debate. When they're against Romney, he has a low energy debate that didn't do well for him. I remember we go back to Al Gore and his sighing that didn't go well for him. You can go back to Reagan and some of the things that he said that did go well for him. But I didn't see anything on Monday that fit that. I can criticize or point out certain things or say that was wrong and that's right or whatever, but I didn't see anything that was going to change people's perceptions of either candidate.
Okay.
That's why I don't know that's going to make that much difference.
Okay. We're down to the last few seconds. Prediction time. Who's going to win?
It's too early to tell.
No. Who's going to win? Let's go on the record.
Well, if we're going to by the polling right now, it would appear to be a Clinton win, but a close Clinton win.
Okay.
I'm holding out for an October surprise.
Oh.
The Jill Stein
surge.
Jill
Stein surge, yes. Well, in honor of John McLaughlin, who just died of the McLaughlin Report, the answer is Clinton. Thank you.
To watch this and other programs on our YouTube page, go to youtube.com/TroyTrojanVision. To find out when programs will be televised, like us on Facebook.